am ready.
Okay. My name's Magid, and I am an entertainer with a group called the Flying Karamazov Brothers. I'm also with a group called the New Old Time Chautauqua. Both of these groups I founded. Chautauqua is a all-volunteer organization that goes to small towns all around the greater Northwest, Alaska, British Columbia, and we basically work on spreading community and engendering community. We're a collaborative organization, so there's lots of entertainers and educators, and we collaborate with the communities that we work with. So, and in the process of working with a lot of people, so I'm a Spanish Jew. My family is currently from Seattle. Before that, we were in Turkey and Istanbul. We've been running from these people, the Catholics and the Christians, for over 2,000 years, and indigenous people only 500 years. So I'm going to tell them, you'll catch up at some point. But anyway, I very much relate to all of this stuff. My family on my father's side was eliminated by the Germans in World War II. My daughter presently is a journalist living in Baghdad, but she can't actually tell anybody she's Jewish because, of course. So we still live with all of this all the time. So anyway, the Doctrine of Discovery is an incredibly important topic, and most people in the United States have no idea what it is. But it is the ruling, it's the ruling law, Supreme Court ruling that governs all land, sovereignty, and title, and actually is sort of the covering for the legitimacy of the United States of America. And it's an incredibly important topic. It is a religious thing, for as much as the U.S. proclaims that it is, a land of tolerance and freedom of religion. Actually, the thing that makes it a country is a religious doctrine, which we'll get into. So, when I go back, we have to start from back a little ways. So, we're going to go way back. This is a hand that was made on a rock and painted by somebody over 30,000 years ago in the Chauvet Caves in France. And basically, the superpower of human beings is their capacity to learn, right? And we've been hardwired over many, many thousands of years to work in small communities and figure it out. And, because it's tough out there to survive. And that's what we kind of do best, is when we learn. This is again from the Chauvet Caves. I mean, this was painted 30,000 years ago, more than 30,000 years ago, during the Ice Age. And I mean, the subtlety, if you ever look at I suggest you go and look at, online at the caves, because the way they use the rock, it's just unbelievable. But the idea that being able to abstract something and then turn it into something that is emotional and meaningful is a very human thing. And I'm kind of we only have an hour and a half, so I'm going to try to go through this quickly. But so there's kind of two ways to look at land. There's, we're part of it, which people from this land actually, we're perhaps some of the most successful societies ever, right? Most of the people who live in, like the Macaws or the Sklalams here, and, the Yakima, or, they've been on that land for a lot longer than any society anywhere on the planet, right? For 14,000 years, maybe longer. It means that it's an incredibly successful society. My tribe, the Jews, have only been Jews for 3,500 years, which, is only a third as long. And most people have been on this land here in what we call the United States. So the other way to look at land, of course, is you own it, you control it, you dominate it, you change it, you make it something something else, into power, basically. And so this is an image of the city of Ur, which is where my family was from about 3,500 years ago. And it is a city-state. It was from the civilization called Sumeria, right? And their genius idea was being able to, do agriculture and then turn it into state power, right? So, and in a way, they also changed how learning happened. So now instead of it being small groups of people who, work together and live together, they became large groups of people, and some people were out on the land, and some people were religious figures, and some people were the people who were running the state, who were sometimes basically both religious and, the power of the state, like a king. And this is the first time this kind of happened. This has happened more than 6,000 years ago in the Mesopotamian Valley, in the Tigris, Euphrates. And then that led to the first empires. Egypt was the sort of first empire where they started, becoming something much larger than just a city-state. They became a power in a vast area of land, conquering other smaller states and turning into a much larger one.
What was the time frame Egypt was?
Egypt started about 5,000 years ago. So about 1,000 years after Sumeria, Egypt started growing, and the way its power, I don't have a lot of time to go through everything, but its power base was really based on the sort of idea of a pyramid, right? There was the pharaoh, and then, the idea of having standing armies and then using the people you conquered as another way to grow your army and continuing to grow those armies. And also it had the Nile River, which was this incredible, basically a power stream, right? You could use that river both as sustenance to run, to have enormous sums of people doing agriculture and gaining incredible wealth. And so, and that led to other, powers. Babylonia was the first hegemonic power, right? They started conquering, like, way outside their zone, including, the Israelites and people like that. And what they learned was that if you conquered them and then basically said, okay, do what you want to do, that's cool, you just have to pay a tax, okay, and we won't kill you. Right. And the other thing they did, which came with that, which was another sort of new thing, which goes into the Doctrine of Discovery, was they came up with laws, right? Well, a law is a magic spell. This is the way I choose to think of it, right? It's a thing you write down, and then people have to follow it, right? It's something that goes for everybody, and if they don't follow it, they'll kill you. Right? That's basically how it's backed up. It's backed up by force. Of course, there's many, places you go before they'll actually execute you. But that's, in the end, it's, either the sword or the gun that's enforcing the law, right? And so a guy named Hammurabi, who was a king of Babylonia, had this stele which has all the laws of the land. There's about 285 of them, I think, spelled out on this stone here, and you had to follow them, right? And this really works well in an empire situation. Rome was like, Rome went farther than almost anybody had before. There had been, Alexander the Great had been, made a huge empire, but it only lasted for so long, and it broke up into smaller pieces. The Persians had a huge empire, but Rome really established itself as a power that went on for many, many years, over 1,000 years. And I bring this up because it's because of Rome and what happened in the next, after it turned into an empire, which is it had been a republic run by people, senators, and had been sort of run on the Greek idea of democracy, which is basically some rich white people who run everything, but they all vote as rich white people get to vote, and then that got curtailed for having an emperor. So. Rome conquered all over the place. It conquered where my tribe lived, which is Israel, and this is Jerusalem right around the time of Yeshua, who some people call Jesus, and it was a province of Rome, and Rome basically said, you guys can do what you want to do, just like the Babylonians do, which works really good for really large empires. But if you screw us over, like any mafia family, we're going to come there and we're going to break your legs, And so, in the year 30 or so, this guy named Yeshua, who is a Jew just like I am, thought he might be a possible Messiah, right, or Meshiach, as we say. And there were lots of people who were claiming this at that time. And one thing that I'll briefly talk about is that the Jewish idea of a Messiah is really different than what Christians think of as a Messiah, right? For Jews, nobody who's alive and a human being could ever be a deity, right? That's just impossible to think of. Jesus would be horrified to think that people think of him as a God incarnate, right? And anyway, so he lived. He got, killed by the Roman Empire for being a renegade and being a rebel, and challenging their power, and and there were Jews at the time who were working with the Romans, just like there are in any society that are taken over by a larger power. There are people who choose to work with that power. And it's still the case here also with Native American nations. There are people who, which we'll get into, who choose to work with the power because they're going to come break your legs otherwise. Yeshua was, a Jewish guy from the day he was born to the day he died. He never thought of himself otherwise. And all his apostles also thought that they were all just Jews, that this guy had been, a possible Messiah, but, it hadn't happened. However, this guy, who was also a Jew, but he was from Tarsus, which is a very Hellenic city, which is to say it was, pretty lax as far as his Judaism went. He was working for the temple as a thug, enforcing the people who were working for the Roman, with the Romans, the Jewish people working for the Romans. He was enforcing their laws, right? And people like Yeshua were rebels to them. And he was basically a guy who would go and break your legs. And then he had this vision of seeing Jesus on the road to Damascus to do actually a policing thing he was going to go do. And he was the beginning of the Doctrine of Discovery. And what I mean by that was that there was only one way to salvation, right? That, there was salvation, and there was only one way to it, and that was by believing in that messianic character named Yeshua, right? And if you didn't believe in that, you were going to go to hell, right? And that he was a God incarnate. That was another one of his genius ideas. And that anybody, not just a Jewish person, could be a Christian, someone who believed in Christ. That was another one of his genius ideas. And you didn't have to follow the Jewish laws. So these ideas, basically those ideas took over what had become the movement about Yeshua and became, kind of got globalized in the Roman Empire. And that spread, for the next few hundred years, was persecuted by the Romans for hundreds of years, both Jews and Christians, or Jews who believed in Jesus, and also non-Jews who believed in Jesus. And that was basically the case until this genius guy showed up. Okay, this is Constantine, who was an emperor of Rome. He was a complete bloody megalomaniac, like many of them. He killed his wife, he killed his son, he killed all his in-laws. But when he was about to kill his brother-in-law at the Milvian Bridge in Rome, because Rome had been broken up into more smaller pieces, and he wanted all of it, right? He was coming out of Constantinople. So this is in about 312 that this battle happened. And just before the battle, he had this vision of seeing a cross in the sky, and the Kiro, which is the first two letters of the words of Christ, right? Which is what he had put on the emblem of all the soldiers afterwards. However, he never actually converted to Christianity until his death, the day he died. He remained a pagan. But he had this brilliant idea. After he became the Roman emperor of everywhere, after he killed everybody and became the Roman emperor, he, in 325, held, which some of you probably all know about. This is the Council of Nicaea. You guys heard about the Council of Nicaea?
The Nicene Creed.
The Nicene Creed came from the Council of Nicaea. So the Council of Nicaea was held in 325, and he had this brilliant, brilliant idea that because of the intolerance of Christianity, right, there's this intolerance built into the very basis of Christianity, that if you don't believe it, then you're going to hell. And therefore, it's something you can enforce, right? So if you match state power and combine it with religious power and make it into something that you can enforce, then you can have everybody be religious and be under your control. And so he brought together all these people he'd been persecuting, or the Romans had been persecuting for many, many years, in this council in Nicaea, which is in present-day Turkey, and sat there with his sword on his lap and said, so what is this Christianity thing? And they went, well, it's this or it's that, and there were some talks about, there's a lot of discussion about whether it was three spirits or one spirit, or whether, the God, because Christianity is based on the Trinity, right? Which I'm sure you all know about. But at the beginning, there have been many different, opinions about whether it's three different things, or it's all one thing, or it's one God and the Son is under that God. Anyway, they had all these different opinions about this. And he basically dictated the terms of what it was, and then also wrote the Nicene Creed, which people still say to this day, right? So this guy is still in everybody's head right now, right? He was just a complete genius, a bloody person, but a complete genius.
Would you call this like the really first formulation of politics?
It's the first. It was the first modern time. It's modern. We're still living with this guy, right? All the way the United States is built, the way European countries are built, thanks to him, right? It totally works. It's hard to even stop it in any way. It's like a virus. It is just unbelievably powerful and incredibly successful. Okay? So that, he turned the Roman Empire from a pagan thing into a Christian empire, became the official state religion, and if you didn't go for it, right? And that seems to work really well, right? So when you go conquer someplace, you turn everybody into not only a citizen of the empire, but a religious citizen of the empire. And then you've got their hearts and their bodies and their minds, right? All in the same thing. And if they don't follow the rules, you've got ways of dealing with that are
justification to kill them.
Yeah. And so you, in a way, also turn people into not people if they don't believe it, right? Which is the other sort of thing that's going to start happening because of this. So Christianity spreads all over the place, but then a new sort of intolerant religion raises its head, which is called Islam, right? And Islam also had the same idea. Basically, you don't believe it, and they spread like all over the place. This started, my other major in college was medieval Islamic history, but we won't go deeply into that. But basically, these two intolerant religions met each other many times over the next bunch of years, right? They invaded Spain, which is where my family lived. My family got to Spain about 2,000 years ago, maybe a little more, with the Phoenicians, as traders, and we've been living there for a long time. And then these crazy people, these Visigoths who had become Christians came down from the north and invaded Spain, and then in 700, more fanatics from the Arabian Desert ended up in Spain because of this incredible way. Again, it's really hard to beat empire that has a religious element as part of state power, right? It's just hard to defeat it. If you're just a little small group of people, what are you going to do? They're coming with you. Hordes of people are coming for you, right? So they met. One of the places they met was in Constantinople, named after Constantine, right? Which was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which was the last remnant of the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire lasted until a day in May of 1453, like about 500 and some odd years ago. And Mehmed II basically finally took away the Byzantine Empire, conquered it, and that became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. He was an Ottoman Turk. It's a whole other story which we won't go into, but it shook the Christian world, right? They were really, really shook. They had done, which I didn't get into, there's been the Crusades, right, had happened. And the Crusades were an important part of this, actually. Because, again, that's where Christians met Muslims on the battlefield, and there had been a Christian empire or kingdoms in what's called the Holy Land. And it had all been building up to this whole new genius idea. When I say genius, I don't mean in a good way. Right? I mean, it's just genius. It means that it works and is hard to stop. So, in the same years, in 1450, this guy, Henry the Navigator, who was the son of this guy, Alonso V, King of Portugal, had been sending ships down to West Africa. And they'd been seeing that the Muslims down there had been making just a boatload of money selling black slaves. And they kind of wanted to get in on the action. I mean, you have to think of these people a lot like they're the mafia, because that's basically what they are, right? They're families who are running an organization that's out there to make money, right? And so, but they have this religious component to it, which gives passion to the people who are killing people for them in the name of something they think is the greater good, right? So Henry, the Navigator, tells his dad, we got to get in on this action. Can you write a letter to our buddy, the Borgia Pope, right? This is Nicholas V, and if you ever heard of the Borgias, but this guy had several mistresses and lots of children. So, religion's one thing, but, money's another thing. And so, and beautiful women. So he came up with a genius idea. And it began the beginning of commercial slavery and the beginning of modern prejudice and, against people. It began what we think of as racism today, right? Where somebody becomes less than a person, right? And before that, anybody could be a slave, right? If you got conquered, well, you got conquered and you were a slave. But it doesn't mean you were an idiot. It just means you got conquered. And that's what, you could be a white person, you could be a black person, They hadn't met Native Americans yet, but, Later, you could be a Native American, you could be Chinese, anybody could be a slave. It didn't mean you were less of a person as far as who you were as a human being. It just meant you lost. Your family, your society, your country, whatever, had lost a battle or whatever, or you've been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It didn't mean you were not a human being. But this was another genius idea, right? So he wrote this thing called, which is now called the Doctrine of Discovery. This is the first one. It's a papal bull. It's called Dum Diversas, and which means until different, written on June 18th, 1452. And I just got a little bit of it here. I mean, this, it's a little longer than this, but we weighing all and singular the premises with due meditation, and noting that since we had formerly by other letters of ours granted among things free and ample faculty to the aforesaid King Alfonso V, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wherever so placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever, held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit by having secured the said faculty, the said King Alfonso, or by his authority, the aforesaid Infante, justly and lawfully has acquired and possessed, and doth possess these islands, lands, harbors, and seas, and they do of right belong and pertain to the said King Alfonso and his successors. Okay? So this is the beginning of the United States of America, right here. Right? This is the justification that is the religious justification that says that basically if you are a Christian monarch and you discover a land, you know it's there, but if you discover a land, discover doesn't mean discover. It means it's like discovery, like, the legal term discovery, it's a legal term. If you discover the land and there's no other Christian monarch there who's, taken his right as a Christian monarch to take that land, then that land becomes terra nullius, as though nobody lived there, even though it's full of people, right? And all the people who live there are now going to be, by law, subdued. So you have to go in there and kill as many as you need to in order to subdue them. And then you reduce them to perpetual slavery, and everything they have and everything they own are yours, and they are your slaves, right? That's the Christian idea from the Pope. The Catholic Church has refused to rescind this still. There are native, indigenous people from all over the world who've gone to the Pope many times, especially recently, especially with this Pope, and tried to say, please, this is crazy business. They won't do it.
Isn't there even other language where the church has declared that they own and the earth is sovereign, that the church owns and dominates the entire planet?
Yes.
Aren't there other legal...
There are many legal things, and they have not rescinded it. But yes, because this is such a huge subject, and we have so much to do, but there's the idea of dominion of the earth. There's so...
Wait, I didn't catch that one. The church owns the earth?
As the universal apostolic church, Catholic means universal, church, it means that, and because Christ is the only way that, you can go through to God, and because they are the vicars of Christ, and the Pope is, in fact, the infallible decision maker for God, then the church, of course, because this is the only way, is, in fact, the owner of the entire
Is that like going to the moon and putting the flag there first?
Yes, we're going to get to that. So, but this is the first one about...
What did you call that document?
It's called Dum Diversas. It's called they're all called the Doctrine of Discovery. Doctrine of Discovery. You can look it up. There are books about it, but most Americans have no idea what it is. In fact, most Native people have no idea what it is. And it's the thing that rules their lives. They don't even know about it. A lot of them do, but a lot of them don't. So this is the next one, there were a number of papal bulls that came out. The next one was Romanus Pontifex, the Roman pontiff. Since we formally, by our other letters, granted among things, they're trying to, get this thing precise. Things free and ample faculty, the aforesaid King Alfonso to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ whatsoever, placed in the kingdom, to dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods, whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself his successors as kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them into his profit by having secured this said faculty, the said King Alonso, or by his authority, the aforesaid Infante, which is his, successor, justly and lawfully, has acquired, possessed, and doth possess these islands, lands, harbors, and seas, and the due right belong pertaining to King Alonso and his successors, not without special license from King Alonso and his successors themselves have any other, even of the faithful of Christ, been entitled hitherto, nor is he by any means now entitled lawfully to meddle therewith. So what they're saying here is, okay, so they started taking all these places, right? They started, and in West Africa too, which became the centers of the slave trade, right? And so slavery and the acquisition of indigenous lands are totally combined, right? They're the same, they come from the same source. And people don't realize that as well. And that the way we treat African Americans today, and why they were enslaved, and how they were brought here, and why they were treated, and why they were thought of as non-humans, just like Native Americans or Indians were thought of not as humans, all are based on these documents, right, as religiously. So, 1492, big year for my family. That's the last year that we were allowed to live in Spain. So beginning of 1492, in January, Granada, which was the last Moorish Muslim kingdom in Spain, succumbed to this, Castile and Aragon, which was, Ferdinand and Isabella. Their armies went there. They actually won it without a fight because they said, look, just if you give it up, we'll leave everything just the way it is. Kind of the Roman promise, you guys can do whatever you want to do, we won't kill anybody. So they gave up because they were the last one left, right? They didn't have any more allies. And within a couple of months, they had burned their library and basically rescinded their citizenship. And then in late March of that year, issued the proclamation of expulsion to the Jews, right? And so my family had to leave within 3 months, which back then was like, go now, because there were no cars or airplanes, right? And we had to leave Spain or get killed or convert. And the last day we could leave Spain was August the 2nd, which was the day that this man got in his ship and took off going west, right? Not a coincidence. And anyway, he goes west and finds these islands with these dark people on them. And Indian doesn't mean from India, right? That's a misnomer. India means Indio, in God, right? People think it's some sort of mistake with Indians over in India, but it's not. As also, what does America mean? Here's a good one, right? Amerigo Vespucci, but where did that come from? America, think about it. I speak a lot of Latinized languages. Amer comes from Latin to love. Rica, riches. That's where we live, right? To love riches, right? That's the whole concept of this place, is to extract. And so, anyway, he finds this place, and there's no Christians around. He goes back, talks to Ferdinand and Isabella. They write a letter, and to this guy, another Borgia, and he, Alexander VI, not Nicholas V, actually, and he comes up with a new Doctrine of Discovery, papal bull, which is called Inter Caetera, among other works, is what it means. And Portugal, but he's having to deal with the Portuguese who are saying, wait a minute, there's some over there? But I thought we had some sort of deal going on with you and so anyway, he divided what they thought was the world at that moment, and so that's why there's a Brazil. Right? They divided the world. They didn't know where it was over there, but they made this line, and so the Spaniards basically got west of the line, and then the Portuguese got the east of that line. But it basically said the same thing. If you find there's this place over there, and it's full of all these non-Christians, it's yours for the taking as long as you discover it, right? So I'll go back. This whole thing was a legal thing you had to do to discover the land. You had to go through all this mumbo jumbo. So you'll see it's all there. You have to have the banner of your monarch. You have to have the sword. You have to have the book. You have to have a priest. And you have to say a certain set of words, and it has to be witnessed by some Christians, right? And that's when you discover the land, right? And then it's up to you to figure out where the extent of that land is. But all the people who you've discovered who live in that land have now it's as though there's nobody there, and they are your slaves forever. Okay, that's what it means. So that's what he's doing there. He's doing he's making a magic spell, and all these people are going to believe it, and they're going to, because they believe it, even though they're probably some of them very nice people when they're back home with their families or whatever, they're going to go and kill a lot of people with families and kids. I mean, these people were so bloodthirsty. I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures of what Columbus and his buddies did on their islands in the 4 journeys that they went there, but it's just horrific, right? It's just horrific. I mean, it makes me shake to think about it. But, it's all comes from the same idea that if you're not a Christian, basically, you're not really a human being. So this Doctrine of Discovery thing started to become very popular, and all the other kings wanted them. So Henry VII got his Doctrine of Discovery. He was still a Catholic, right? It wasn't until Henry VIII, right, that they broke with the Catholic Church. But Henry VII got his, and he then sent off this Italian guy, Giovanni Caboto, who we know as John Cabot, but he didn't speak a word of English, and his sons, and they came and discovered North America, right? And so the British went, okay, we've discovered it, and all those people are now going to be our slaves, and those will be our colonies. But it took a long time for them to manifest that. So it wasn't until much later that, the first really successful colony came of people that were so fanatically religious, so Christian that even Christian England said, out, you guys are too fanatical. And they were basically Calvinists, and we don't have time to go into all this stuff, but it's there's a whole thing about predestination, which and the elect, and which all kind of works into, if you're wealthy, then God is smiling on you. If you're poor, you must be immoral, which is a whole other thing which goes on in this country, right? So they met up with the Wampanoags, and this is the supposed Thanksgiving meal. And then, of course, not many years afterwards, they killed all those people, and the ones they didn't kill, they sent off into the West Indies in slavery. The very same people. And there's none of those people left that we know of. Very dangerous to deal with pilgrims. But so that is our founding sort of myth, but it was all under the edict of the Doctrine of Discovery, issued to Henry VII, given to John Cabot, and then, the British considered this area theirs.
It's a very romantic picture, by the way, I mean, there's It's the imagery is just, it probably didn't happen at all, right? I mean,
Right, or she's poisoning, the food's poisoned, right? So,
Well, I mean, and there's Miles Standish. I don't know if you heard of him. He was a horrible man. I mean, there's a great book called The Mayflower by a guy named Nathaniel Philbrook, and in it he has a peace treaty where he goes and meets with some of the Wampanoags, and they go into one of their structures. He goes and meets with them, and they all sit down. They're about to pass the pipe, and he just pulls out his knife and he kills all of them. One guy, because they are just not, this is a peace treaty, right? They're going to talk. And he just kills them all. And then he cuts off their heads and puts them on spikes. And, all the other natives around there are like, holy shit, who are these people? Who are they? They have no respect. That's that guy. So the British colony becomes quite huge. They're, by the time of the French and Indian War in the 1750s, which is like 130 years later, there's like a couple million settlers, and a lot of them are Irish, Scottish, people who basically there's a thing called the clearances that happened in Scotland, and of course Ireland had been completely decimated by Cromwell, and all these people got pushed out, and they sent a lot of them to the United States, right?
but they were wealthy when they left, right? They had some means.
No.
They had nothing. How did they get ships and get here?
They got shipped because they were basically like in penury, and some of them were what do you call those? Self-indentured. They owed money for their trip, and then they had to work for 6 or 7 years to pay it off. And then there's all this free land. All you had to do was kill an Indian to get it. So and there weren't Christians, so it was cool. And
is that true? That the Indian killing thing?
Yes.
You kill one Indian.
No. You would go into an area, right, and start your farm or whatever, and there would be Indians nearby, and then if they, there are constant battles going on.
But that wasn't the template or the written rule. You kill an Indian, you get
No.
Okay.
No.
It just sounded.
No. I meant that in general terms.
Okay.
It was basically true, not in India, but if you killed Indians, got rid of them in the area that you were settling, then,
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah.
You cleared out your land from pests.
Exactly.
Okay.
But you also had, because they didn't have enough people, so the French had taken up, what as northeastern Canada, right? And there was a lot of friction between the British and the French, not only in on this continent, but on the other continent. So they were always at each other's throats at this point. And so there was this huge war that went on for quite a while, and both of them made allies with various tribes in North America, and and it was a very confusing situation for North American indigenous people, right? It's hard to conceive of how different it is that white people look at land and Indians look at land, right? It's just really hard to imagine. And so it's still even hard to imagine. And so, and they're in this really difficult situation of do we support this huge superpower, which has the possibility of killing us all if we don't support them, or this other superpower, which could also do the same. And so anyway, they divided for various reasons, basically sort of regionally, and there was this awful war that went on for a really long time, and which was won eventually by the British, who way outnumbered the French, basically, in the end. And one of the people that fought in this war was a guy named George Washington, and he was one of his big jobs in the army, the British Army, was as a land surveyor, right? And so he kind of went way far west where some of these battles were happening, and meanwhile he was doing that, he was taking note. And one of the things people don't know is that at the time when he became president, he was the richest person in America because of land. So what happened in the American Revolution was that the Brits, after they had fought this war, and won against the French, made a deal with the Indians, saying, "Look, we're not going to go west of the Alleghenies. We're just going to leave that forever to your hands. We're not going to allow any more settlers to go over there, and we're really going to be strict about it." And the weird thing was, they were, and it really pissed off the people who'd come here to get land from Indians, right? And especially guys like him, who were super rich, and that's how they made their big bucks, was on land speculation, right? And
were they buying and selling? So
yeah, what they would do is they would set up a company with a bunch of stakeholders or whatever, and they would go and buy land from Indians, right? And most Indians didn't know what was going on or what they were talking about, and then it was like the futures thing, right? Like, we're gonna have all this, and there's nobody there now, but and then we're gonna sell this and that, and then there'd be places that they bought which were closer to settlements, and then they open that up to settlement. But when the Brits put this line down and said no more past there, and they had already put money out for like in Ohio Valley and in Illinois and places like that. I mean, they'd already been speculating way west of that line. So most of him and his rich buddies went, "Hey, they can't do that." So they decided that they weren't going to work for that mafia boss anymore, the guy King George III, and they got all their lieutenants and buddies and worked for to start the American Revolution. A lot of people think it's about taxation. It was part of it, without representation. But the real thing was that they were going to lose their shirts if they didn't do something about it.
What years were they?
What? It was at the beginning, 1775, 1776. So we're going to get into that actually, because there was the war. It was a battle for control of land, of native land, right? It was a battle of control. Who owned that land, and how far could you take? Nobody knew exactly how far west you could go, and they wanted to be able to go as far as they could go, because that was their right under the Doctrine of Discovery. So in 1775, along with other investors, this guy named Thomas Johnson, who's this guy, who was a Supreme Court justice, buys a bunch of land from this tribe called the Piankashas, who now no longer exist, in nowadays Indiana and Ohio, with a company called the Illinois Wabash Company, right? This is one of those speculator companies that I was telling you about. This is 1775, right? Before the war. And he's speculating, right? He's a Supreme Court, he'll become a Supreme Court justice in America later on. But right now he's a land speculator, which is this is where the big money was in land speculation, right? And you do whatever you needed to do to fool Indians, to cajole them, shoot them, whatever it took to get control over certain land areas, right? And this is how you made big money. And this is a Piankasha Indian, one of the few, there were no photographs at the time. These people don't exist anymore. But they unknowingly, I think, sold to him and his buddies. And then the war happened, and there was great confusion about land ownership. Right, because if you're under a monarch, all land belongs to the crown, right? So it's called crown. It's still called that in Canada. It's called crown land, right? All land belongs to the crown. Even today in Canada, legally, all land belongs to the Queen, right? It all belongs to the Queen. Even if you buy something,
it's leased.
It still, in the end, belongs to the Queen, right? It's called crown land, and so. And they then give you, you can buy land, they give you, licenses and things like that to buy land from the crown. But after the revolution, there's no more monarch. It was kind of an unusual situation. Nobody knew what to do. So this guy named McIntosh, who was also a chief of his tribe from Scotland, but now is in the United States, and I kind of like that they're pretty similar in some ways. Wants to get that land that Thomas Johnson had bought, right? And he realizes that he bought it from an Indian. Now, according to the Doctrine of Discovery, Indians can't sell land because they have no rights, because they're not really people. They don't really, because it's terra nullius, they don't really live there, right? This all sounds crazy, but it's actually true. So he sues, so Johnson gets control of the land from the government, who basically agrees with him, and so Johnson sues McIntosh, right? It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And so this is Chief Justice John Marshall, who most Americans think was a great Chief Justice. And, you know, again, on the genius level of evil, he was a great Chief Justice, you know. But on the idea of can Indians own land, he went way back, like I'm trying to do with this little discussion. And he said, okay, so, you know, we started off with this is how land was owned, and then there was the Doctrine of Discovery and the Papal Bulls, which gave license to John Cabot, who discovered this, and then the Brits owned it, and it was a crown land. And basically, what this ruling, which is called Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823, and I strongly urge everyone to actually read it, especially if you're a Native person, you should read this because this is what controls your life. He basically said it is true. The precedent continues. The Doctrine of Discovery is the rule in the United States of America. All land belongs to the federal government, goes from the crown to the federal government. So that continues in the United States. The idea of crown land is now federal land. We hear it every day, you know. And if you buy property in the United States, you actually don't really own it. The federal government owns everything all the time. So, you know, it's eminent domain. Why does that exist? Because it's federal land, right? And he also said Indians are perpetual wards of the state. Always, will always be wards of the state. And they only have the right of occupation. They do not have the right of ownership. Okay? So this is before reservations. This is before, you know, the BIA, because they didn't know, there wasn't the law, there wasn't a magic spell yet of what to do, right? Of how to make this happen and control land and power in America.
What's the BIA?
In a way. Well, exactly. Good question, because what happens in, here, I want you guys to read this. The law of it, this is from the ruling, and there's so much of it, but the law of every dominion affects all persons and properties and situate within it. And the Indians never had any idea of individual property in lands. It cannot be said that lands conveyed were disjoined from their dominion because the grantees could not take the sovereignty and eminent domain to themselves. Since they had no idea that they were owners of the land, how could they own the land, basically, right? That's what he said. Such then, being the nature of the Indian title to the lands, the extent of their right of alienation must depend upon the laws of the dominion under which they live. So since they had no laws of their own, we got laws. We'll show them some laws, you know. They are subject to the sovereignty of the United States. The subjection proceeds from their residence within our territory and jurisdiction. It is necessary to show that they are not citizens in the ordinary sense of that term, since they are destitute of the most essential rights which belong to that character. They are of that class who are said by jurists not to be citizens, but perpetual inhabitants with diminutive rights. The statutes of Virginia and all other colonies and of the United States treat them as an inferior race of people, without the privileges of citizens and under the perpetual protection and pupillage of the government. This is the law right now. This is the law that runs everything in the United States. It stands written as written, and there's lots more of it like that. And it's hard to believe, but that's how the United States is actually guided as far as, you know, land and sovereignty and title goes, right? This law has never been changed. It still stands. So, now they had their magic, their little magic spell, and so the next year after this decision in 1824, that's why that year is there, they began the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is under this Department of the Interior, and continues to exist to this day. This is the organ of control to control the lives of the wards of the state, who are under continual pupillage of the United States government, right? That's what their law says. They gotta follow the law. So they began this thing, but now, how do you deal with all these wards of the state, these inferior race of people? So the first idea was removal. Like, okay, there's all these white settlers here. These people are not Christians. They obviously are just a big problem for us. They imagine they fight for their own land and for their families. They do terrible things. Let's just get rid of them, right? So there were some more cases, and which I won't get into completely here, but basically these are laws which went to the Supreme Court, rulings that went to the Supreme Court. Actually, John Marshall tried to stop removal as a way of dealing with things. And so there was this case which said do removal, then there was this case which said stop removal, and then Andrew Jackson, who our president thinks it was the bee's knees, was one of the worst, most corrupt, unbelievably genocidal people that ever existed in the United States, just didn't even listen to the Supreme Court and just got rid of all the Cherokees and the five, what they called civilized nations, and they moved them to Oklahoma. Many people died. There was also another removal from the north, another trail of removal happened to the Oneidas. It happened to a lot of different people, which we'll get into in a little bit. But that was the first idea. Just get them out of there, right? In fact, we were at, where were we? And somebody said there's no people. Oh, it was a thing about the Doctrine of Discovery we went to here in Port Townsend. And so some people from Ohio, and they were like, there's no Indians in Ohio. Yeah. They all got thrown out, because of removal, right? And, and another weird statistic, awful, is that most people in the United States still think that continue to think Indians don't even exist, right? Most Americans don't know Indians exist.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
We live out west, so we know that they do. But you live in like Ohio, or you live in, any of these places where they got rid of all of them. Whoever saw an Indian? I think I saw one in a movie one time.
Yeah, John Wayne.
Yeah, exactly. And they got rid of them there.
Well, that's why Jackson should be removed from the $20 bill.
No shit.
Oh, that guy. He was a Hitler. He was a horrible person.
Bob Marley on the $20 bill.
There you go.
So then the next idea was came in 1851 was the Indian Appropriations Act, which is where all the treaties from 1855 came from, right? So they had to come up with more magic spells. So this is they thought another brilliant idea. What we'll do is, removal is incredibly brutal. We'll just put them on a piece of property and they can't get off, and we'll have all the white people all around them, right? So that happened in 1851. This was the actual treaty that the Nez Perce, I'm just taking them because I've worked with them a lot, and I have some maps which I'm going to show you about what this all means. But anyway, so that was the original reservation, which of course got reduced, as most reservations did from the original ones. This is the land that they ceded in the Treaty of 1855, and then they got reduced to this in 1863, which was what led to the Chief Joseph War. So they had been making treaties with Native nations, for a long time. They started in the 1780s, basically, making treaties with, and they made some global treaties, like the Jay Treaty, which allows for natives to pass across the border. And that was made in 1794. They made treaties with the Oneidas. They made treaties with, all kinds of East Coast tribes, all of which are broken. And why can any treaty be broken? Legally? Because they have no rights. They really are, they're just wards of the state. So it doesn't, as long as the Congress makes an act of Congress, it's not breaking a treaty. I mean, you have to put this into your, and I try to tell my Native friends this all the time. There is no sovereignty until this Doctrine of Discovery is rescinded, because they can do whatever they want, and we'll see how they've done whatever they want over and over and over again, right? So this is the first treaty that was made in 1784 with the United States. It's the first time it was made with Delaware since 1784. So all right. So then there was the Dawes Act of 1887. You guys ever heard of allotment? No? Okay. So here's the treaty. Here's the reservation they got reduced to in 1863. Then all these white people and settlers are going, hey, there's like really good land on that reservation, and we're letting just these people who aren't people be there and even be on that. And so they came up with another brilliant plan, a genius plan. It's called allotment. So we'll give each Indian and family 160 acres on their reservation. And then once they've got their land on that reservation, then we'll open up the rest of it to white settlement, and they can buy the land, right? So this is the present day Nez Perce Indian Reservation. This is a map that they've made. So right after the Dawes Act of 1887, white people started buying land. So basically all these white pieces are owned by white families to this day, right? So the green parts are the ones that the tribe owns in general trust, and these are what are called tribal fee lands, which I won't get into because it's all very complicated, but basically 90% of their reservation is not owned by them, right? To this day. They're trying to, in fact, when we were there, when the Chautauqua was there about 3 years ago, they had a big meeting while we were there. I think it's just coincidence, but I like to think I had something to do with it. But they decided they were going to start buying back their land, which a lot of Native nations have been doing. You know, like the Kootenai Salish have bought back half of their reservation, which is kind of how you have to do it if you're going to get it back into tribal control.
And they're allowed to buy land.
Huh?
They're allowed to buy land.
They're allowed to buy land privately, yeah. As the tribe's allowed to buy land, you know, it can all, but well, we'll get into it. It all can be taken from them. So the other thing that started happening were Indian schools. This is all under the BIA, and this is where they had another genius plan. Kill the Indian, save the man was the motto, basically. Because these non-Christians, you know, they had these, you know, weird ideas. They were not following Jesus. So they kidnapped children, all Indian children, pretty much everybody on every tribe, everywhere on this continent were kidnapped, in Canada here, taken to these schools. This is in Fort Simcoe, where we've done a bunch of work with the Yakima Nation at the state park there, because it's got a very dark history in the last couple hundred years, or 150 years. You know, because this was the Yakima Nation's winter camp. And then after the Treaty of 1855 was broken, the Yakima went to war, and there was a big war from 1856 to 1859, and the Army set up its fort here, what they call Fort Simcoe, which is actually called Mulmul, which means springs, or two springs. And then after they had subdued the Yakima, they set up the Indian school here, and it was set up by a guy named Father Weber, who was a particularly brutal man. And in fact, the guy who I was working with the state parks, and we actually got a guy named H.A. Barney to be the ranger there. He's a Yakima, you know, enrolled member. And he was telling me that they had an impaling tree where Father Weber would like impale a kid on the tree if he was like acting up, and then he would just hang there dead for, you know, and a lot of people had chains and little balls, you know, and anyway, that was the Methodist Church. It was run, all these schools were run by different churches, right? And they all got paid by the US government for each kid. But basically, if you wanted to make it profitable, it was better not to feed the kids. better to make them work rather than teach them anything, cut their hair, and if they talked any of their native languages, they were beaten severely and abused. We don't have many statistics about the U.S. Indian schools. The Canadian government 4 years ago, the Supreme Court said that, the Indian schools had been cultural genocide, and they started actually gathering statistics. In Canadian schools, 40% of the kids didn't come out alive. So when I talked to some of the elders from the Yakima Nation, we had a ceremony there by the springs, and their parents and grandparents had been at the school, and they said there was like a grave of kids back there somewhere, a lot of bones somewhere. And so anyway, it's just a very brutal thing. It was run by the Catholics, Methodists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Quakers, and a couple other denominations. And it went on for a long time, like 3 or 4 generations. The last Indian school really didn't close down until 1978.
Really?
And so it was legal to kidnap. You wouldn't see your kid basically from the age of 4 until the age of 18. Imagine if your children were kidnapped. I always say, like, what if the Chinese took over the United States and they kidnapped your children at the age of 4, took them away, and they came back speaking Chinese and hating everything about your culture because they've been beaten down to them. And so Native people have to live with this because, it's just brutal. Anyway, so then another thing that happened was the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which basically put some control back in reservations, and started the tribal business councils, which we'll kind of get into. I got to get going. Oh, this is another Yakima. The Yakima Nation, they're super strong people. I mean, they're unbelievable. And so there's this guy, Nepo Strongheart, who was on the Chautauqua stage, which is kind of one of the reasons I really also enjoy talking about him. He spoke about, he's one of the first Native Americans to actually, and he was the first person to actually speak about Native American rights on a national level, and almost single-handedly got Native Americans the right to vote in 1924. And then there's the Tribal Business Council. So the way reservations work now is that most of them have tribal business councils. They're all kind of constructs of the U.S. government. So sometimes they can be often corrupted. And they're not based often, these days it's changing, which is amazing and wonderful, but often it has been in the past where they were based around resource extraction and, trying to get people to sign things that maybe other people, elders wouldn't sign and things like that. But everything that a tribal council, and this is the Caldwell, first business council for the Caldwell Reservation. Everything that they decide has to go through the BIA, right? So that's how it works. The BIA is in every reservation, there's a BIA office. It's usually a rundown little building somewhere. And there's white guys in it, and they're basically, any decision you make has to go to them, has to go to Washington, has to get okayed. So there's still reservations are, the way I think of them is refugee camps, right? They're the oldest refugee camps in the world. And they're federal facilities. They're like a jail. The people get commodities. It was part of the treaty that they were going to get fed, but they get the worst that the government can come up with, the cheapest stuff. So on most reservations, people get diabetes. It's just, the health situation is really bad. And tribal councils these days, I think a lot of them are doing a really great job, but they have in the past been troubled. Also, there's another thing most white people don't know about, that all Native Americans have to carry a card. It's their blood quantum card, right? And most Native people think, it's, just normal business, but it's really craziness, right? They should decide who's an Indian and who's not an Indian. What this is, so this guy here, for instance, is 7/8 this tribe, right? But I was at the Caldwell General Assembly a year and a half ago, and a lady stood up, and she had kids. And they're all 100% Native Americans, but not enough of any tribe to be enrolled. So they will not be a member of any tribe legally, right? And every Native American has to carry this card, right? So it's a form of apartheid in a way, right? They're not, it's a federal government, this is something that's the federal government requires of them. So another thing that happened, which is just goes to show the government can do whatever they want. Anybody ever heard of termination policy? So this happened in the 50s and the 60s, basically. It started in the 40s, but they ended the recognition of 109 tribes in the United States. A lot of them in California, a lot of them out here in the West. They were basically, the idea was, Indians should just be like regular Americans, and we'll just get rid of their reservations. And then they also had a policy of trying to get them to live in cities. So a lot of people today who are like my age were part of this thing where they got moved out to Seattle or got moved here or there. They were encouraged to get out of the reservations, not live their life like their tribe had done for many thousands of years, and to become regular Americans. And this went on. They actually ended, even though they had treaties with these people, they ended their reservations with an act of Congress. Hi. So, and I bring this up because, one, it's just important to know, again, that the U.S. government can do whatever they want with Native Americans as far as control goes, right? They can do whatever they want. Any act of Congress can abrogate any treaty, and they can end their reservation, they can end their recognition as a tribe. There is no sovereignty if the U.S. government decides there isn't any, legally. So,
but we'll fight.
Yes.
Rub them out.
I know.
Because it will not ever happen again.
I hope not, but Trump is considering, if he wins the second term, because I know this, they're considering termination policy for all Indian reservations.
And what's so, like a lot of people are jealous. I mean, every time whatever Indians have, people want. That's why we are. So people are jealous because of the casinos.
All right.
But some casinos they are making a lot of money, and they're doing a lot of things to help their people that they haven't had, that they've been very poor, and people think, oh, they're rich. And a lot of tribes are doing well, but there are still tribes that aren't. And for that to happen would really, put them in a bad space. And so I just hope that people remember that because one nation is very successful with their casino, it doesn't mean all are or all have casinos.
Or if they do termination policy, no more casino. No more anything. You're just out there. So, these are all aspects of the Doctrine of Discovery, right? Wounded Knee happened because of a tribal council war, basically. There was a really evil, corrupt tribal council on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and a lot of people who wanted to live life as they should and for their community didn't want to, kowtow to these people, and there was a general battle, and then they called in the feds, and I don't need to go through the whole history of Wounded Knee, but it's another outcome of this thing, right? This ruling is everywhere, right? This whole thing just spreads through everything. It's the matrix on which this country is built, right? Private property, and the reason we have title is because the Indians aren't Christians, and therefore they have nothing. They own nothing, and they don't deserve anything. So, and then the Bolt decision, that's Billy Frank Jr., who, was an incredible person, and really, that was an amazing thing that happened. And this, again, all that can be rescinded, though. That's the problem with this stuff, is it's all the magic spells, right?
So what was it?
Huh?
He said, what was the Bolt decision?
Oh, I'm sorry. So, all right, some people are from the Northwest. So the Bolt decision was basically, this guy wanted to fish on this river that his family had been fishing on for thousands of years. And white people said, you can't fish there, you don't have a fishing license. And he's like, I don't need a fishing license. I have the right, according to the treaty we made with you guys, to fish it whenever I want. So he got arrested, 50 times? you know. And he was also an incredibly generous and amazingly, you know, even-keeled kind of a person who just kept saying, this is our right to do this. So it finally went up through the courts, and a guy named Judge Bull decided that, in fact, they had the right to do this, and in fact, they made a division so, you know, natives get, in Washington State, get 50% of the catch of certain things, and, you know, they have the right to go, you know, for clams and, you know, shellfish on shorelines, and so this was upheld, which had a big influence on all sorts of things in the United States. Again, though, it's a court decision under the United States of America. All this could be rescinded, which is the problem, right? There's no guarantee about any of this.
Rescinded by, Mecca, I need a little bit more information about that. By going and saying, oh, that judge made that decision and we're wiping it out?
Act of Congress.
Oh, with an act of Congress.
Act of Congress. See, Indians are, because of the Doctrine of Discovery, Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823, only have the right of occupation and are wards of the state. They have no actual rights. So the U.S. government can do whatever they want with them as long as it's done through an act of Congress, which is how all this stuff gets done, right? So if there's a legislation made saying the Bull decision's wrong, Indians get nothing, the treaties that we made with them are no good anymore, that's what happens.
And of course that is based on Catholicism and the Vatican, and it really has anything to do with America. Those guys aren't even Americans.
We covered
I know, sorry. I mean, I know that part, but I gotta say.
So this is the last time that the Doctrine of Discovery came up to the Supreme Court. It was in 2005. It was the city of Sherrill versus the United Nation. And what happened was the United got removed, and when removal was the thing to do, and they got removed to Wisconsin and Minnesota. And but they're from New York, so they started buying property. Like, this is a lot of things that Indians do. They start buying property, right, and get it back. But they didn't want to pay tax on it because they're like, hey, this is our land, we're buying it, and we don't want to have to pay tax on it to the state. We don't recognize the state of New York, right? So it went up to the Supreme Court, and they said, and also it's all under the Doctrine of Discovery. They kind of went for the big potato here. They were like, it's the Doctrine of Discovery that has to go. And in a unanimous decision in 2005, which is not that long ago, the Supreme Court decided that unanimously that, in fact, the Doctrine of Discovery still continues to be the law of the land. It holds precedent, and basically Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wrote the opinion about this, who everybody is a wonderful person in women's rights, but when it comes to Indians, she basically said, we can't open this box. If we open this box, we call into question the legitimacy of the entire United States of America. So therefore, it has to stand as is, as written. All that stuff that we read is that is the law, right? That Indians are an inferior race. You didn't see that part, but that's what it says.
I know all that stuff.
Yeah, right. But that's the law. That is,
anyway.
That's what it says. So, then Standing Rock, this is our Chautauqua and people from Port Townsend, and we got some S'Klallam folks, and we all went out to Standing Rock, and that was sort of the next, iteration on this whole thing about the Doctrine of Discovery, right? Because this is you guys all know probably the story of Standing Rock, but it's Army Corps land. What is Army Corps land? How can they get it? How do they get it from a reservation? All that kind of stuff. How can they just put pipelines through anywhere on any Indian reservation? Well, because of the Doctrine of Discovery. They can do whatever they want, So,
and lie about it.
Yeah. So, and then this just happened, like a month ago, which is amazing. Again, the Yakima were just like, this was basically, they've got a gas station, and they bring in fuel, and they don't want to pay Washington State tax. And Washington State said, you used our roads to bring in the fuel, so you got to pay tax. But the treaty says that they can use whatever roads they want. And unbelievably, the Gorsuch sided with the other liberal court folks and decided for the Yakima Nation. which is a big thing, actually. It's a really big thing. But, by a hair. But this is the latest sort of big thing that's just happened. And it really just happened.
And that was a U.S. Supreme Court decision?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's a big deal.
It's still a decision of the United States government.
Yes, it's always the United States government. No matter, that's the important thing for them is we're making the decisions here, right? So the other thing is, which, I'm trying to just give you, and I'm not so out of time, but, another big thing is, like, when I was on the Yakima Reservation a year and a half ago working with, about Fort Simcoe and stuff, I was talking with one of our friends there, and she and a bunch of other women brought up the fact that there were like 31 missing women. That was a couple of years ago on the Yakima Reservation alone, right? No investigations, right? Because it's a federal facility. When it comes to a murder or something like that, the tribal police don't have any jurisdiction over that, right? It's the federal government, it's the FBI. And they basically just don't investigate. They just don't have anything to do with it. And if you're a white guy, you basically can get away with murder, right?
That's
because
true.
you can, yes, it is absolutely true. And it's another form of the Doctrine of Discovery. It's just evil. It's just, and it's happening right now.
And it's worse in Canada.
What months were 700, 800, 1,500? What's the number?
4,000 in Canada.
4,000.
Yeah. But no, we just don't know the statistics. I wouldn't say it's worse.
No, it is worse.
You think so?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It is absolutely worse in Canada,
Okay.
especially in this area. I don't know about the other ones, but in this area, it's terrible.
Because
It's just terrible.
the thing about
on our reservation, the
Which one are you
FBI, Warm Springs, the FBI will work with tribal police on those kind of things. Whether they come to any results in the end, but they will investigate and work
really,
with tribal
at
police.
the Yakima Reservation, I don't know.
It's so spotty up there, though. See, we're our whole area,
Mm-hmm.
and the Yakima, because it's more checkerboard, and so it makes it maybe a little bit different. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Well, one thing is, which I'll just bring up, is that the U.S. keeps very little statistics on anything to do with Native Americans. They also keep under lock and key, which I didn't bring up, but I know this for a fact because I have a friend who works with the archives, because it actually tells, they didn't know at the time when they were making the maps that they weren't supposed to be telling that, right? They're just noting down where people were. So a cool thing that's kind of going on now is in British Columbia, right? So the Canadians didn't quite get far enough west to, put a gun to their heads before it became sort of embarrassing to do that. And so they didn't sign treaties with, a bunch of the folks way out in the west, native tribes, native, what they call First Nations out, in the west of, in the ocean, basically, the Haidas, Bakudo, people like that. And so they sort of woken up these people, the native folks there, and got, what are you going to do? You're going to come shoot us? This is all our land. How can you say it's not our land? And in Canada, the Doctrine of Discovery is hidden under precedent. It's still the ruling law in Canada, but I finally have found enough paperwork I can, show my Canadian lawyer friends how to find where the precedent is. Because there's another thing, I'm out of time, but it's called settled law. You ever heard of this? Settled law, right? So whenever you talk to a lawyer about, all this land belonged to the S'Klallam, or this land, and, we should be discussing this or whatever, they go, well, that's settled law. It doesn't belong to them. It's the term for, we don't want to talk about this. And so I have some friends in the Culver Reservation, their lands extend up into Canada, right? Like a lot of tribes do. And there was the Lake Arrow Indians, you heard of those guys? And they were they were considered extinct by the Canadian government in 1956. They called them extinct. And they were going, hey, we're here. But, they took all their land, of course, because they could, because it's all Doctrine of Discovery. And so for years they've been trying to get back recognition from the Canadian government. So they sent a guy up there. He shot an elk, brought it into the police, the RCMP, and said, hey, look, I shot an elk. I don't have a license. I'm a Lake Arrow Indian. I don't need a license. And they arrested him. It went to trial, and the judge decided that, in fact, they exist. And there was a big celebration about a year ago in March up in Nelson, and I went to talk to the white lawyer who had won the case for them, and I said, so did you use the Doctrine of Discovery? Did you use that at all? He said, oh no, that's settled law. And I said, it's not settled law. How can you say that? You're representing these people. It's like, that's the ruling law. And they just don't want to talk about it. Not really. You know, maybe little things here and there we'll give to them, but not that. So anyway, but in British Columbia, there is hope. There's really interesting discussions going on. They're going to get a lot of land that will be under their control completely. And so that is a way to think about what could happen if we ever overturned Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823. Well, that is a way that might, they're going to have to actually talk to the Indians for the first time ever. But I don't know that it's going to happen in my lifetime. I mean, the way things are going, it's going to be a long time, to happen. But anyway, thank you. And sorry it took so long, but